Millionaire CEO was about to make a cold business deal until the client's child called him Dad. What happened next will shock you. A single moment can change everything, even for the most powerful people. Adrian Wolfe checked his Patek Philippe watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Punctuality was non-negotiable in his world. Tardiness meant weakness, and weakness had no place in the cutthroat realm of high-stakes business. From his penthouse office window, he observed the city below, a playground he'd conquered through sheer determination and calculated precision. "Mr. Wolfe, your 2 o'clock is here," his assistant's voice buzzed through the intercom. "Send them in," Adrian replied, his tone clipped and efficient. At 40, Adrian had built an empire from nothing. Wolfe Enterprises dominated 3 industries and was poised to absorb a 4th today. His net worth had long since crossed into the billions. But the money had stopped mattering years ago. What mattered was the game, the chess match of acquisitions, mergers, and ruthless efficiency that left competitors scrambling to keep up. He straightened his custom Tom Ford suit and adjusted his crimson tie, the color of power, of blood in the water. His office was a testament to his philosophy. Sleek, modern, and devoid of sentimentality. No family photos cluttered his desk. No personal touches softened the edges of his glass and steel sanctuary. Personal connections were liabilities. Emotions were inefficiencies. The door opened, and Adrian's face transformed into a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Robert Carson, CEO of Carson Technologies, entered with his team of lawyers and advisors trailing behind him. Today's meeting would conclude the largest acquisition in Adrian's career, a $2.3 billion deal that would cement his legacy. "Robert," Adrian extended his hand. "Right on time." "Adrian," Robert's handshake was firm. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries. We both know why we're here." Adrian appreciated the directness. "My lawyers have prepared everything. The terms remain as discussed." The next hour passed in a flurry of legal jargon and financial projections. Adrian remained focused, occasionally interjecting with pointed questions or clarifications. His mind calculated every variable, every potential outcome of this acquisition. By acquiring Carson Technologies, Wolfe Enterprises would eliminate a rising competitor while gaining access to patents that would revolutionize their product line. "I've reviewed everything," Robert finally said, fatigue evident in his voice. "Despite my board's reservations, I believe this is the best path forward." Adrian didn't acknowledge the subtle admission of defeat. Instead, he slid the final contract across the polished conference table. "Then, let's make it official." His assistant appeared with champagne, Dom Perignon, naturally. A small indulgence Adrian allowed for closing major deals. The lawyers exchanged knowing glances. Everyone in the room understood this moment's significance. Carson Technologies would cease to exist as an independent entity by morning. "One last toast to independence," Robert suggested, a hint of bitterness in his voice. Adrian raised his glass with practiced grace. "To new beginnings." The champagne flutes clinked as Adrian's phone vibrated. He ignored it. His schedule was meticulously managed to prevent interruptions during critical moments like this. Whatever it was could wait. Nothing was more important than this signature. Robert sighed heavily, picked up the Mont Blanc pen, and hovered it over the signature line. Adrian watched with the focused intensity of a predator. Years of strategic moves had led to this moment. The pen touched paper. The door to the conference room swung open. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wolfe," his assistant stammered, her usual composure shattered. "She insisted—" A small figure darted past her into the room. Adrian's irritation flared instantly. Who would dare interrupt this moment? His gaze dropped to the source of the interruption. A child. A girl no older than 7, with unruly brown hair and a faded blue dress that had seen better days. "Mr. Carson." Adrian kept his voice level, though ice edged each word. "I wasn't aware this was a family meeting." Robert looked up, confusion etching across his features. "She's not—" The girl's wide eyes scanned the room before settling on Adrian. She took a tentative step forward. "Dad?" The word hung in the air like suspended glass, fragile and impossible. The room fell silent. Adrian's practiced smile faltered for perhaps the first time in decades. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Adrian said smoothly. though something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. "I don't have children." The girl took another step forward, her hazel eyes, a distinct, unusual shade, locked onto his. "My mom said you wouldn't remember her, but she said you'd know me because I have your eyes." Adrian felt the weight of every gaze in the room shifting between him and the child. Robert's eyebrows had risen nearly to his hairline. "Young lady," Adrian maintained his composure, "I think you've confused me with someone else. Now, we're in the middle of an important meeting." "Lena," the girl said quietly. "My mom was Lena Carson." The name hit Adrian like a physical blow. 8 years ago. A brief relationship, 3 months at most, before he'd ended it cleanly and moved on. Lena Carson. Beautiful, passionate, and ultimately too emotional for his carefully structured life. Robert stood abruptly. "Carson? What is this, Wolf? Some kind of sick joke?" Adrian's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after years of careful planning. "I assure you I have no idea what this is about," Adrian replied, but his voice lacked its usual confident edge. The girl reached into her small backpack and pulled out a worn photograph. "Mom kept this. She said it was the only time she saw you really smile." Adrian didn't need to look. He knew exactly which photograph it would be. Santorini. The White Cliffs. The one impulsive vacation he'd taken in his adult life. The timing aligned perfectly with the girl's age. "Who brought you here?" Adrian demanded, his composure cracking. "My aunt," the girl replied. "But she's sick now. She can't take care of me anymore." Adrian's assistant hovered at the door, panic evident in her expression. This was so far outside the realm of controlled scenarios that her training offered no protocol. "Mr. Wolf," Robert's voice had cooled considerably. "Perhaps we should reschedule." "That won't be necessary," Adrian insisted, even as the deal began slipping through his fingers. "This is clearly some sort of mistake, or—" "Are you calling my daughter a liar?" Robert interrupted, his face reddening. "Your daughter?" Adrian's confusion was genuine. "Not by blood," Robert clarified, his voice tight. "Lena was my sister-in-law. She married my brother after—" He gestured vaguely toward Adrian. "After whatever happened between you two. She passed away last year. Cancer." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The girl wasn't just claiming to be his biological daughter. She was also the niece of his biggest acquisition target. The coincidence was too perfect, too devastating to be random. "I didn't know," Adrian said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. When was the last time he'd admitted ignorance about anything? Clearly, Robert's tone was glacial as he closed the contract folder. "I think Wolf Enterprises and Carson Technologies might not be as compatible as we thought." Adrian watched years of planning disintegrate in seconds. The acquisition, the market advantage, the billions in potential revenue, all vanishing because of this small child with hazel eyes that mirrored his own. "What's your name?" Adrian found himself asking the girl, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. "Ella," she replied, her small shoulders squared with a dignity beyond her years. "Ella Carson. But Mom said my real last name should have been Wolf." The conference room felt suddenly claustrophobic. Every eye watched Adrian, waiting for his reaction. This wasn't a scenario he could control with money or power or legal maneuvering. This was messy, unpredictable, everything he'd structured his life to avoid. "Everyone out," Adrian ordered, surprising even himself. Except for Robert and— he hesitated. "Ella." His team exchanged glances but complied immediately. Adrian's word was law within these walls. When the room had emptied, Adrian gestured to a chair. "Sit down, please." Ella climbed onto the leather executive chair, her feet dangling well above the floor. The contrast between her worn clothes and the opulent surroundings couldn't have been more stark. "Robert, I need to understand what's happening here," Adrian said, struggling to process this turn of events. Robert's expression remained hard. "Lena was married to my brother James. They raised Ella together. James never knew." He glanced at the girl, choosing his words carefully. That Ella wasn't biologically his. When they both passed, James in an accident 3 years ago, Lena last year, my wife and I took Ella in. "And now?" Adrian prompted, sensing there was more to the story. Robert's professional demeanor cracked. "My wife has been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. We have 3 children of our own. With the medical bills and everything else? He trailed off, the implication clear. So you brought her here to what? Leverage her for a better deal? Adrian's voice hardened. I didn't bring her anywhere, Robert snapped. She ran away from home last week. We've been searching everywhere. I had no idea she'd come here. I didn't even know about you until this moment. Ella's small voice interrupted their tension. I found Mom's old things in the attic. There were letters and pictures. She looked directly at Adrian, those hazel eyes unsettlingly familiar. She wrote that if anything happened to her and Dad, James' dad, that I should find you, that you would take care of me. Adrian felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine shock. Lena had known him for only 3 months. How could she possibly have thought he would care for a child? He'd made his priorities clear from their first date, his empire, his ambitions, nothing else. I think, Adrian said carefully, that we all need some time to process this situation. Robert gathered his documents. The deal is off, Wolf. I won't do business with a man who abandons his responsibilities. I didn't know she existed, Adrian replied, an unfamiliar defensiveness creeping into his voice. And now that you do, Robert challenged. Adrian looked at Ella, who sat quietly watching the adults decide her fate. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. Was it guilt, responsibility, or simply irritation at this massive disruption to his carefully ordered life? She can stay with me, Adrian heard himself say, while we figure this out. Both Robert and Ella looked equally surprised by this pronouncement. You can't be serious, Robert said. You know nothing about raising a child. I know nothing about being a father, Adrian corrected, but I know everything about solving complex problems. And this, he gestured toward Ella, is simply a problem that needs solving. Ella's expression fell slightly at being described as a problem, but she remained stoically silent. Robert looked between them, clearly conflicted. This isn't some business transaction, Wolf. This is a child's life. I'm aware, Adrian replied coolly. And I'm offering a solution that benefits everyone. Ella gets a stable environment while your family focuses on your wife's health. We can discuss permanent arrangements later. And the acquisition? Robert asked, his business instincts surfacing despite the personal drama. Adrian's smile returned, calculated and precise. We'll revisit it. Perhaps with adjusted terms that reflect this new relationship between our families. Robert's expression hardened. You're still trying to leverage the situation. I'm acknowledging reality, Adrian countered. Business and personal matters have become entangled. We'd be fools to pretend otherwise. As the adults negotiated, Ella sat quietly, her small fingers tracing patterns on the polished table. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. I can help, she offered. I'm good at being quiet. I won't be any trouble. The simple statement, so earnest, so resigned to being an inconvenience, struck Adrian in a way he couldn't immediately identify. This child, this unexpected complication to his perfectly structured existence, had already accepted that her value was measured by how little space she occupied. It reminded him uncomfortably of himself at that age. You won't need to be quiet, Adrian found himself saying. This is a temporary arrangement while we sort things out. Robert looked deeply skeptical. I'll need some assurances, legally speaking. Of course, Adrian nodded. My lawyers will draft something appropriate. In the meantime, he turned to Ella. Do you have any belongings with you? She patted her small backpack. Just important things, pictures and Mom's letters. The simplicity of her worldly possessions contrasted sharply with the opulence surrounding them. Adrian made a mental note to have his assistant arrange for appropriate clothing and whatever else a 7-year-old might need. Very well, Adrian extended his hand to her, an automatic gesture he immediately questioned. What was the protocol for interacting with a child who might be your daughter? Let's get you settled, and then we can talk more. Ella slid off the chair and cautiously took his hand. Her fingers were small and warm against his palm. Adrian felt oddly off balance, as though the floor beneath him had subtly shifted. I'll be in touch, Robert said, gathering his things. At the door, he paused. Wolf, if this is some elaborate ploy to salvage the deal. It isn't, Adrian replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. When Robert had gone, Adrian was left alone with Ella, their hands still awkwardly joined. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Adrian Wolf had absolutely no idea what to do next. "Are you really my dad?" Ella asked, looking up at him with those damning hazel eyes. Adrian considered his response carefully. "I think that's something we'll need to determine properly, but it's possible." Ella asintió como si esto fuera una respuesta perfectamente razonable. "Mom said you were very smart and always knew exactly what to do. She said that's why you'd be able to take care of me if something happened." Adrian felt an unexpected twinge. Lena had spoken well of him to their child, despite how coldly he'd ended things. The revelation was both touching and unsettling. "I'm not sure your mother knew me as well as she thought," Adrian admitted, leading Ella toward the door. "But we'll figure this out." As they walked through the offices of Wolf Enterprises, Adrian was acutely aware of the stares from his employees. The fearsome Adrian Wolf, holding hands with a small girl in a faded blue dress, was clearly the most shocking thing they'd witnessed in the company's history. For a man who had built his life on absolute control, this moment of complete uncertainty should have been intolerable. Yet, as Ella's small hand tightened around his, Adrian felt something entirely unexpected. A flicker of curiosity about what might come next. The carefully structured life of Adrian Wolf had just collided with chaos, and nothing would ever be the same again. If you enjoyed this story so far, please like, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Adrian's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the city's most exclusive residential building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views that most people only saw in travel magazines. As the private elevator opened directly into the marble foyer, Ella gasped softly. "It's like a castle in the sky," she whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the minimalist luxury surrounding them. Adrian watched her reaction with detached curiosity. "It's just a place to live." "Do other kids live here too?" Ella asked, peering down the long hallway. Number just me. And now, apparently, her. The thought was still surreal. Adrian led her to one of the guest bedrooms, a space designed for visiting executives or occasional overnight companions, not children. The room, like the rest of the penthouse, was decorated in shades of gray and black, with clean lines and expensive but impersonal furnishings. "You can stay here for now," Adrian said. "My assistant will arrange for some appropriate things for you tomorrow." Ella nodded solemnly and placed her worn backpack on the king-sized bed. The contrast between her faded clothes and the luxurious surroundings made her look even smaller, more out of place. "Are you hungry?" Adrian asked, suddenly aware that he had no idea when children typically ate. "A little," Ella admitted, "but I can wait if you're busy." Again, that eagerness not to be an inconvenience. Adrian found it simultaneously convenient and vaguely troubling. "I'll have something prepared," he said, retreating to the safety of delegating tasks. He texted his personal chef, who normally prepared meals 3 days a week, and left elaborate instructions for reheating on other days. While waiting for food to arrive, an uncomfortable silence fell between them. Adrian checked his phone, dozens of messages about the aborted deal with Carson Technologies. Millions of dollars in preparation costs, now potentially wasted. His board would demand explanations. The market would react once news leaked. All because of this small person sitting quietly on his expensive Italian leather sofa. "Can I ask you something?" Ella dijo de repente. Adrian looked up. "Yes." "Did you know about me? Before today?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. He considered lying. It would be easier, cleaner. But something in those hazel eyes made him reconsider. "No," he answered truthfully. "I didn't know about you." Ella nodded, absorbing this information. Would you have wanted to know? The question was impossibly complex. 8 years ago, knowledge of a child would have derailed everything he'd been building. He would have seen it as a catastrophe, a trap even. But now, with his empire established and his position secure, he still wasn't sure. "I don't know," he admitted, the words unfamiliar in his mouth. Ella parecía aceptar esta respuesta. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn envelope. "My mom left this for you," she said, holding it out, "in case I ever found you." Adrian took the envelope hesitantly. His name was written on the front in flowing handwriting he recognized immediately. Inside was a letter, a photograph, and a silver bracelet. a delicate band with a small wolf charm that he'd given Lena during their brief time together. The photograph showed them in Santorini, just as he'd suspected. Lena laughing, her hair blowing in the breeze, and beside her, a version of himself he barely recognized, relaxed, smiling genuinely. His arm around her shoulders in a casual display of affection he'd never allow himself now. He unfolded the letter, his heart pounding unexpectedly. "Dear Adrian," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and Ella has found her way to you. I never told you about her, and for that, I'm sorry. When I discovered I was pregnant, you had made your priorities clear, your company, your ambitions. There wasn't room for a family in your 5-year plan." Adrian's throat tightened. She wasn't wrong. "I didn't keep her from you out of spite," the letter continued. "I kept her from you because I believed we would both be happier this way. I found love again with James. He raised Ella as his own and loved her completely. She has been happy, Adrian. That's what matters most." The chef arrived with dinner, temporarily interrupting Adrian's reading. He instructed her to set up in the dining room and return to the letter. "But I always knew there might come a day when she would need you. You're the most capable person I've ever known. The most determined. If anyone can protect her and give her a good life, it's you. She has your eyes, your mind, and yes, sometimes even your stubbornness. She is extraordinary, Adrian. Get to know her, and I think you'll agree." The letter ended simply. "She's yours too, Adrian. She always has been. Lena." Adrian folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. 8 years of unknown fatherhood compressed into a few paragraphs. It seemed impossible. "Did you read it?" he asked Ella. She shook her head. "Mom said it was just for you, but she told me if anything happened, I should find you, that you would know what to do." The weight of that faith, from a woman he'd known briefly, nearly a decade ago, settled uncomfortably on his shoulders. "Dinner's ready," he said, unable to process everything at once. "We should eat." Over dinner, a gourmet meal his chef had hastily modified to be more child-friendly, Adrian observed Ella carefully. She ate neatly, with better manners than many business associates he'd dined with. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of expressions or mannerisms that seemed eerily familiar. "What happens now?" Ella asked as they finished eating. "Now," Adrian said, falling back on what he knew best. "We need more information to make proper decisions. Tomorrow, we'll arrange for a DNA test to confirm everything, and then we'll determine next steps." "A DNA test?" "To confirm whether I'm really your father," Adrian explained. Ella looked down at her plate. "And if you are?" The question hung in the air between them. Adrian had built his career on decisive action, but this situation defied his usual approach. "If I am," he said carefully, "then we'll figure out what that means, for both of us." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all he had at the moment. That night, after showing Ella how to use the guest bathroom's complicated shower system and finding her a t-shirt to sleep in, it hung to her ankles like a dress, Adrian retreated to his home office. He had damage control to manage. The Carson Technologies deal was in jeopardy. His board would want explanations. The market would react. He worked until nearly midnight, crafting strategies to salvage what he could from the day's disaster. When he finally emerged from his office, he paused outside the guest room door. A sliver of light showed underneath. He knocked softly. "Come in," Ella's small voice called. He found her sitting cross-legged on the massive bed, surrounded by photographs, letters, and small mementos, the contents of her backpack laid out like artifacts from a foreign country. "It's late," Adrian said. "You should be sleeping." "I couldn't," Ella admitted. "It's too quiet here, and too high up. I feel like I'm floating in the clouds." Adrian glanced around, seeing the stark room through new eyes. "It is quiet," he agreed. "I've always preferred it that way." Ella asintió, como si estuviera archivando esta información sobre él. "Mom kept all these things," she said, gesturing to the items spread across the bed. "She said someday I'd want to know where I came from." Adrian approached cautiously and saw that the photographs and letters documented a history he'd been completely unaware of. Ella's history, her first steps, birthday parties, school performances. "May I?" he asked, indicating one of the photos. Ella handed him a picture of herself at perhaps 3 years old, laughing on a swing, her hazel eyes, his eyes bright with joy. The evidence was becoming harder to deny. "Tomorrow," Adrian said, returning the photo carefully, "we'll make arrangements for clothes and things you need, and the DNA test." "What if I'm not yours?" Ella asked quietly. "Where will I go then?" The question struck Adrian like a physical blow. It was the logical next step in his analytical approach to the situation. But the way she asked it, so matter-of-factly, as though she was accustomed to being passed from place to place, unsettled him deeply. "We'll cross that bridge if we come to it," he said, falling back on business platitudes. Ella began carefully gathering her treasures, returning them to her backpack with the careful attention of someone who knew the value of having everything important in one place, ready to move at a moment's notice. "You should try to sleep," Adrian said, moving toward the door. "Mr. Wolf?" Ella called as he reached for the handle. "Thank you for letting me stay, even if it's just for now." Adrian felt that strange tightness in his chest again. "You can call me Adrian," he offered, unsure what else to say. "Adrian," she repeated softly. "Good night." "Good night, Ella." As he closed the door behind him, Adrian leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. His perfectly controlled world had been upended in a single day, and he had no strategy, no contingency plan for this situation. In his bedroom, he found himself staring at the photograph from the envelope, himself and Lena in Santorini. He barely recognized the man in the image, smiling without calculation, without agenda. When had he become the person he was now? When had control and power become more important than anything else? Tomorrow would bring clarity, he told himself. DNA tests would confirm or deny. Lawyers would draft agreements. His structured world would reassert itself. But as he drifted towards sleep, Adrian couldn't shake the image of Ella, carefully packing away her treasures, ready to move on if she wasn't wanted, ready to be someone else's problem. "She's yours too, Adrian," Lena's words echoed in his mind. "She always has been." Morning arrived with harsh clarity. Adrian woke at precisely 5:30 a.m., as he did every day, and completed his usual routine: exercise, shower, black coffee, before remembering the small guest occupying his spare bedroom. He paused outside her door, uncertain whether to check on her or let her sleep. Children needed more rest than adults, didn't they? This gap in his knowledge irritated him. He opted to let her sleep and retreated to his office to make necessary arrangements. First, he called his personal physician to schedule a DNA test, discreetly, with results expedited. Next, his assistant, to clear his calendar and arrange for appropriate children's clothing and necessities. Finally, his lead counsel to discuss potential legal implications. Each call was made with his usual efficiency, but the subject matter felt surreal. "Mr. Wolf." His assistant's voice held uncharacteristic hesitation. "What size clothing should I purchase for the child?" Adrian realized he had no idea. "She's 7. Whatever size 7-year-olds wear." "Yes, sir." She paused again. "And does she have any preferences? Colors or styles she likes?" The question caught him off guard. "Just get a reasonable selection, nothing excessive." As he ended the call, Adrian noticed a small figure standing in the doorway. Ella wore the same clothes from yesterday, her hair slightly wild from sleep. "Good morning," she said formally, as though addressing a stranger. "Good morning," Adrian replied, equally formal. "Did you sleep well?" "The bed is very big," she said, which wasn't exactly an answer. "And everything is so quiet up here, no street sounds or neighbors." Adrian nodded, making a mental note. "Are you hungry?" "A little." She twisted the hem of her faded dress. "I can make my own breakfast if you show me where things are." "That won't be necessary. I've arranged for food." Another delegation of responsibility, easier than facing the awkwardness of attempting to cook breakfast for a child. The morning passed in a strange dance of politeness. Ella ate the gourmet breakfast his chef had prepared, her legs dangling from the high kitchen stool. She was quiet but observant, her eyes taking in every detail of her surroundings. Adrian found himself unusually self-conscious under her steady gaze. "My assistant is bringing some new clothes for you," he said as she finished eating. "And I've arranged for a doctor to come this afternoon, for the test we discussed." Ella asintió solemnemente. "And then you'll know if you're really my dad." "Yes." The word felt inadequate. We'll know for certain." His assistant arrived an hour later with more shopping bags than seemed reasonable. Adrian had instructed her to purchase necessities, but she'd apparently interpreted this broadly. Clothes, shoes, toys, books, a tablet, even child-friendly toiletries. Enough to outfit a small boutique. "I thought it best to be thorough, sir," she explained, eyeing Ella with barely disguised curiosity. Adrian dismissed her with a nod, and she retreated, clearly bursting with questions she knew better than to ask. "Are these all for me?" Ella asked when they were alone, touching one of the bags with hesitant fingers. "Yes. You'll need appropriate things while you're here." "Thank you," she said with formal politeness that seemed odd coming from a child. Adrian checked his watch. "I have some work to do. Will you be all right entertaining yourself for a while?" Ella asintió, ya mirando en una de las bolsas. "I'm good at being quiet." That phrase again, a child's understanding that her value lay in her ability to not disturb adults. Adrian frowned slightly but retreated to his office without comment. For the next few hours, he attempted to focus on work, damage control from yesterday's derailed acquisition, preparing explanations for his board, reviewing alternative strategies. But his concentration kept slipping, his thoughts returning to the child in the next room. His child? The possibility seemed increasingly likely, but his mind still struggled to accept it. Eventually, he emerged from his office to check on her. He found Ella sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by books from one of the shopping bags. She'd changed into new clothes, simple jeans and a blue sweater that made her hazel eyes appear even more like his own. "These are very nice," she said, holding up a book. "I like reading." "That's good." Adrian felt oddly relieved by this shared trait. She had arranged the books in neat stacks by size. The toys remained untouched in their bags. Her old clothes were folded precisely on the sofa, and he noticed she'd placed her worn backpack beside them, ready to be packed at a moment's notice. The doctor arrived at precisely 2 p.m., professional and discreet as instructed. He explained the procedure to Ella in simple terms and took samples from both of them with minimal fuss. "The results will be available tomorrow morning," he informed Adrian as he packed his equipment. "I've arranged for the lab to prioritize the analysis." "Good." Adrian handed him an envelope containing significantly more than his usual fee. "I appreciate your discretion." After the doctor left, an awkward silence fell between them again. Adrian checked his phone, dozens of messages requiring his attention. The Carson Technologies deal remained in limbo, with Robert Carson not returning his calls. His board was demanding an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. The markets had already begun speculating about the aborted acquisition, with Wolf Enterprises stock dropping 2 points since morning. "Are you very busy?" Ella asked, interrupting his thoughts. Adrian looked up. "Yes, there are many matters requiring my attention." "Because of me," she said. It wasn't a question. Adrian considered denying it, then thought better of it. "Partially, yes. Yesterday's meeting was very important." "With Uncle Robert." Ella asintió. "He doesn't like you very much." The blunt assessment drew an unexpected laugh from Adrian. "No, I suppose he doesn't, especially not now." "Because you didn't know about me?" "That and other complications." Adrian pocketed his phone. "Business is complex." Ella considered this. "Mom said you were very important, that you ran big companies and made important decisions." "That's one way to put it. Is it hard, making important decisions all the time?" The question was surprisingly insightful for a 7-year-old. "Not usually. I've built my career on making difficult decisions quickly and correctly." "But I'm a difficult decision," Ella stated simply. The directness caught him off guard. "You're an unexpected situation," he corrected. "That's what adults say when they mean problem," Ella replied, her eyes far too knowing for her age. Before Adrian could respond, his phone rang, the private line reserved for his most important contacts, his board chairman. "I need to take this," he said, already moving toward his office. "I'll be quiet," Ella promised, picking up one of her new books. The call lasted over an hour, a grueling interrogation about the Carson Technologies situation, the mysterious child who had appeared, and how Adrian planned to mitigate the damage to the company. By the end, the chairman had reluctantly agreed to postpone the emergency board meeting until Adrian had resolved the personal matter at hand. When he emerged from his office, The penthouse was unnervingly quiet. "Ella?" he called, a flicker of panic rising when she didn't immediately respond. He found her in the guest bedroom, sitting by the window overlooking the city. She'd arranged some of her new possessions carefully around the room, but the space remained largely untouched, as though she was careful not to make her presence too permanent. "I thought you might want to be alone," she explained, "for your business calls." "Thank you," Adrian said. "That was considerate." She nodded and returned her gaze to the window. "Everything looks small from up here, like a toy city." Adrian approached and stood beside her, seeing the familiar view through new eyes. "I suppose it does." "Do you know all those buildings?" she asked, pointing to the skyline. "Many of them," Adrian replied. "I own several." Ella's eyes widened slightly. "You own whole buildings? And the companies inside them?" Adrian found himself oddly pleased by her impressed expression. "That's why you're so busy," she concluded. "You have to take care of all those buildings and companies." "Something like that?" They stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the city below. The quiet felt less awkward somehow. "Are you hungry?" Adrian asked eventually, realizing it was well past lunchtime. "A little," Ella admitted. "I'll order something," he said, reaching for his phone. "Can we go out?" Ella asked suddenly. "I haven't been outside all day." The request caught Adrian off guard. His first instinct was to refuse. Going out meant exposure, potential media attention, complications. But something in her hopeful expression made him reconsider. "There's a cafe on the ground floor of this building," he offered as a compromise. "We could go there." Ella's face brightened immediately. "Really? That would be nice." The cafe was, like everything associated with Adrian's residence, exclusive and discreet. Still, heads turned when Adrian Wolfe entered with a small child in tow. The maitre d' hid his surprise admirably and led them to Adrian's usual table, secluded in the corner with a view of the entire space. "Your usual, Mr. Wolfe?" he asked. "Yes, and—" Adrian glanced at Ella, realizing he had no idea what she might want. "Do you have hot chocolate?" Ella asked shyly. "Of course, miss, and perhaps some of our freshly baked cookies." Ella looked to Adrian for permission, which he granted with a nod. As they waited for their order, Adrian noticed a business associate at another table watching them with undisguised curiosity. News would spread quickly. Adrian Wolfe with a child? Questions would follow, speculation, rumors. The thought made him tense. "Is something wrong?" Ella asked, noticing his change in demeanor. "No," Adrian lied automatically, then, reconsidering, "people are watching us. It may lead to complications." "Because of your business?" "Yes." Ella nodded seriously. "I heard Uncle Robert on the phone. He called me a complication too." The words hit Adrian unexpectedly hard. He recalled saying something similar himself just yesterday, referring to Ella as a problem that needs solving. "Business people often use that word," he said carefully. "It doesn't necessarily reflect on you personally." "I know," Ella said simply. "Adults always have important things to do. Kids are just in the way sometimes." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of being an inconvenience made something unfamiliar twist in Adrian's chest. Before he could respond, their order arrived, his black coffee and her hot chocolate topped with whipped cream and cookies on a small plate. Ella's eyes widened at the elaborate presentation. "It's so fancy." Adrian watched as she took a careful sip, then smiled as whipped cream left a small mustache on her upper lip. Without thinking, he reached across with a napkin to wipe it away. The gesture felt strangely natural, and yet entirely foreign to him. "Thank you," she said, seemingly unperturbed by his awkward attempt at caretaking. As they sat in the cafe, Adrian became increasingly aware of the whispers and glances from other patrons. His protective instincts, honed through years of corporate warfare, shifted unexpectedly toward the small person across from him. Let them stare. Let them wonder. For once, Adrian Wolfe didn't care about appearances or implications. It was a novel sensation, almost liberating, almost. The following morning, Adrian woke to an unfamiliar sound, soft humming coming from somewhere in his penthouse. For a moment, he was disoriented. His home had never contained sounds he didn't create himself. Then, reality rushed back. Ella. The DNA test. Today they would know for certain. He found her in the kitchen, perched on a stool, carefully turning pages of one of her new books, while humming a tune he didn't recognize. She'd dressed herself in new clothes, leggings and a purple sweater, and had attempted to brush her own hair, though the results were somewhat uneven. "Good morning," he said, startling her slightly. "Good morning," she replied, closing her book. "I was being quiet, but I didn't know how quiet I needed to be." "It's fine," Adrian assured her, moving to the coffee machine. "Did you sleep better?" "A little," she said. "I put some pillows around me so the bed didn't feel so big." The image struck Adrian unexpectedly, this small child creating a makeshift nest in the vast, impersonal space of his guest bedroom. It seemed symbolic of her entire presence in his life, a tiny figure trying to carve out space in his enormous, empty world. His phone buzzed with a message. The doctor. Results were ready. "The test results have come back," Adrian said, his voice carefully neutral. "Would you like breakfast before or after we discuss them?" Ella considered this seriously. "After, please. My tummy feels funny when I'm nervous." Adrian nodded, respecting her decision. "Very well." He opened the email attachment containing the results, though he already knew what it would say. The evidence had been in front of him from the moment she'd walked into his conference room. Those hazel eyes, the shape of her brow, even certain expressions that had seemed unnervingly familiar. "The results confirm it," he said simply. "I am your biological father." Ella nodded, accepting this information with remarkable composure for a 7-year-old. "Does that mean I can stay?" The directness of the question threw him. Stay? He hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been focused on confirming the facts, not planning long-term arrangements. "For now, yes," he replied cautiously. "We have much to discuss and decide." "Okay," she said, seeming satisfied with this non-answer. "Can we have pancakes? The kind with blueberries inside them?" The rapid shift from life-altering revelation to breakfast preferences was jarring, but Adrian found himself nodding. "I'll have some delivered." Over breakfast, blueberry pancakes with extra syrup for her, a protein shake for him, Adrian outlined his plan for the day. "I have several important meetings I cannot reschedule," he explained. "My assistant will stay with you while I'm gone." Ella's face fell slightly. "Can I come with you? To business meetings? That would be highly irregular." "I could sit very still and draw," she offered. "I wouldn't bother anyone." Adrian shook his head. "It's not appropriate." Seeing her disappointment, he added awkwardly, "Perhaps we could do something this evening. When I return—" Her expression brightened immediately. "Like what?" Adrian had no idea. What did one do with a 7-year-old in the evening? "We'll figure something out." His assistant arrived promptly at 9, clearly uncomfortable with her new childcare responsibilities, but professionally determined to excel at them. Adrian provided brief instructions, most involving ensuring Ella didn't touch anything valuable or disrupt his carefully organized home. "I'll be back by 6, he told Ella as he prepared to leave. "Be good." "I will," she promised solemnly. The day passed in a blur of meetings, each one requiring Adrian to compartmentalize the personal turmoil of the past 48 hours. The Carson Technologies deal remained in limbo, with Robert Carson finally agreeing to a call that afternoon. "I assume you've confirmed the situation?" Robert asked without preamble when they connected. "Yes," Adrian replied simply. The DNA test was conclusive. A heavy sigh came through the line. "So, she really is your daughter, and my brother raised her without ever knowing." "It appears so." "And what do you intend to do now, Wolf? She's not some merger you can acquire and restructure." The barb hit close to home. "I'm aware of that. I'm considering options." "Options?" Robert's voice hardened. "She's a child, not a portfolio." "I understand the distinction," Adrian replied coldly. "And I'm taking this situation very seriously." "Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're treating her as an inconvenience to be managed until you can get back to what really matters to you. The next deal, the next acquisition, the next billion." Adrian felt a flash of genuine anger. "You know nothing about my intentions." "I know your reputation," Robert countered. "The ruthless Adrian Wolf who puts profits above everything else. Is that the kind of father Ella deserves?" The question hung between them, uncomfortable and pointed. She is my biological daughter, Adrian said finally. I will meet my responsibilities. Responsibility isn't the same as love, Robert said quietly. That child deserves to be loved, Wolf. Can you offer her that? Adrian had no answer. The day's final meeting was with his board, a tense affair where he had to explain the situation without revealing too many personal details. He framed it as a previously unknown family connection that had temporarily disrupted the Carson negotiations, but assured them that everything was under control. And this situation won't affect your leadership of the company? The chairman asked pointedly. It will not, Adrian replied with confidence he didn't entirely feel. By the time he returned to his penthouse, it was nearly 7, an hour later than promised. He found his assistant looking harried, and Ella nowhere in sight. Where is she? He demanded. In her room, sir, the assistant replied. She's been there for the past 2 hours. She wouldn't come out. Why not? His assistant shifted uncomfortably. She overheard part of my phone conversation with your head of PR about managing the potential media situation regarding your sudden paternity. Adrian dismissed his assistant with a curt nod and made his way to Ella's room. He knocked softly on the door. No answer. He knocked again, then slowly opened it. The room was empty. For a moment, blind panic seized him, a completely unfamiliar sensation. Then he noticed the slightly ajar door to the ensuite bathroom. Ella, he called, approaching carefully. Still no answer. Adrian pushed the door open fully and found her sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, a tattered storybook clutched in her hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as though she'd run out of tears. You're late, she said simply. I had meetings that ran long, Adrian replied, then added uncomfortably, I apologize. It's okay. Adults are always busy. Adrian hesitated, then lowered himself to sit beside her on the bathroom floor, something he would have considered unthinkable 2 days ago. What are you reading? He asked, nodding toward the worn book. Mom used to read it to me, Ella said, running her fingers over the faded cover. It was my favorite. Adrian felt a twist of something unfamiliar. Regret, perhaps? For moments he'd never witnessed, stories he'd never heard, years of her life he'd missed without even knowing. Would you like me to read it to you? He offered, the words surprising even himself. Ella looked up, genuine surprise crossing her face. Really? You want to? Yes. The simplicity of the request to read a children's book made all the complex business negotiations of his day seem suddenly hollow. They moved to the bedroom, where Ella climbed onto the bed and Adrian sat stiffly beside her, the worn book in his hands. He began reading, his voice formal and awkward at first, as though he were presenting quarterly projections instead of a children's story. But as the pages turned, something shifted. The story, about a small wolf finding its family, was simple but resonant. Adrian found his voice softening, taking on the different characters' tones, responding to Ella's rapt attention. By the story's end, they had unconsciously shifted closer together, Ella leaning slightly against his arm as he turned the final page. That was nice, she said softly. You're good at the voices. Thank you, Adrian replied, feeling oddly accomplished, more so than after closing a multi-million-dollar deal. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. I heard your assistant, Ella said finally, her voice small. She said I'm a PR problem. Adrian winced. She shouldn't have said that. Is it true? Adrian considered lying, then thought better of it. From a business perspective, yes. Unexpected situations often require management. So I am a problem. Ella's voice was matter of fact, not self-pitying. No, Adrian said firmly, surprising himself with his vehemence. The situation may be complicated, but you are not a problem, Ella. She looked up at him, searching his face for sincerity. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. Can we have ice cream for dinner? She asked suddenly. The non sequitur startled a genuine laugh from Adrian, perhaps his first in days. Number, but we could have ice cream after dinner. Deal, she agreed, as though they'd negotiated a complex contract. That evening marked a subtle but definitive shift. They ate dinner together, properly at the dining table, rather than with Adrian distracted by work. He listened as Ella talked about her life before, her school, her friends, the small apartment she'd shared with her aunt. After ice cream, chocolate with extra sprinkles for her, a small portion of vanilla for him, Adrian found himself doing something unprecedented, canceling a conference call to continue their conversation. Later, as he tucked her into bed, another first, Ella asked the question he'd been dreading. What happens tomorrow? Tomorrow? Do I stay here, or do I have to go somewhere else? The directness of her question demanded equal honesty. I don't know yet, Adrian admitted, but we'll figure it out together. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this non-answer. Good night, Adrian. There was a slight hesitation before his name, as though she'd considered using another word but decided against it. Good night, Ella. As he turned off the light and closed her door, Adrian found himself standing in the hallway, strangely reluctant to return to his usual evening routine of work and more work. Instead, he went to his office and opened his laptop, not to check stock prices or review contracts, but to search for activities for 7-year-old girls. The search results were overwhelming. Ballet lessons, art classes, playgrounds. How did parents navigate all these options? For a man who routinely made multi-million-dollar decisions without hesitation, this new territory was unexpectedly daunting. Yet, as he scrolled through websites and articles, Adrian felt something unfamiliar stirring within him. Not the usual thrill of conquest that drove his business decisions, but something quieter, warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. A week passed, then two. Temporary arrangements stretched into something resembling routine. Adrian adjusted his schedule, not completely, but enough to be present for breakfast each morning and dinner each evening. He hired a proper nanny, though Ella remained wary of the woman, preferring Adrian's company when he was available. The DNA test results had been filed away, but their implications continued to ripple through Adrian's life. His legal team had drawn up preliminary guardianship papers, though he hadn't signed them yet. The Carson Technologies deal remained in limbo, with negotiations cautiously resuming under new terms that acknowledged the complicated family connection. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, as Adrian reviewed quarterly projections in his home office, his assistant interrupted with news that would shatter their fragile new normal. Sir, there's a Ms. Reynolds from Social Services here to see you. She says it's regarding Ella. Adrian felt his stomach tighten. Send her in. Ms. Reynolds was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with practical clothes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Adrian of his first-grade teacher. Mr. Wolf, she began after declining his offer of refreshments. I'll be direct. We've received a report expressing concern about your guardianship of Ella Carson. What kind of concern? Adrian asked, his voice carefully controlled. The report suggests you may be unsuited to the role of parent. Your lifestyle, your work commitments, your lack of experience with children, all were cited as potential issues. Who filed this report? Adrian demanded, though he already suspected. I'm not at liberty to say, Ms. Reynolds replied, but that's not what matters now. What matters is determining what's best for Ella. And you believe that's not me, Adrian stated flatly. Ms. Reynolds studied him carefully. I haven't made any determinations yet, Mr. Wolf. That's why I'm here, to assess the situation. I am her biological father, Adrian said, the words still strange on his tongue despite their proven truth. Biology is only one factor, Ms. Reynolds countered. What matters is stability, emotional support, and proper care. All of which I can provide, Adrian insisted. Can you? She raised an eyebrow. Your reputation, Mr. Wolf, is not that of a nurturing individual. Quite the opposite, in fact. The assessment stung, perhaps because Adrian knew its accuracy. He'd spent decades cultivating that reputation, the ruthless businessman who let nothing stand in his way. Now, those same qualities that had built his empire were being weaponized against him. Where is Ella now? Ms. Reynolds asked. At her art class, Adrian replied. He'd enrolled her in several activities after researching child development. Art on Tuesdays, swimming on Thursdays, music on Saturdays. The nanny will bring her home in approximately 45 minutes. Ms. Reynolds nodded, making a note. I'd like to see her room if you don't mind. Adrian led her to the guest bedroom that had gradually transformed over the past weeks. The stark, minimalist space had acquired color and personality. Drawings taped to walls, books stacked on the nightstand, stuffed animals arranged on the bed. A child's space, carved out of his sterile adult world. Ms. Reynolds examined everything with practiced eyes, occasionally making notes on her tablet. Adrian found himself uncharacteristically anxious about her assessment. "Mr. Wolf," she said finally, "I need to be very clear about something. My only concern is Ella's welfare. I have no interest in your wealth, your influence, or your business reputation." "I understand that," Adrian replied stiffly. "Do you? Because many in your position assume they can simply overcome obstacles with money or power. That doesn't work with children, and it doesn't work with my department." Before Adrian could respond, they heard the elevator doors open and Ella's voice excitedly explaining something to her nanny. Adrian felt an unexpected rush of relief at the sound. Ella appeared in the doorway, clutching a painting still wet with vibrant colors. She stopped short when she saw Ms. Reynolds, her expression immediately guarded. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Hello, Ella." Ms. Reynolds smiled warmly. "My name is Ms. Reynolds. I'm here to talk with you and Mr. Wolf." Ella looked to Adrian, her eyes questioning. "It's all right," he assured her, though he felt far from certain himself. "Ms. Reynolds works for social services. She's here to make sure you're being properly taken care of." Understanding dawned on Ella's face, a child who'd had too much experience with the system. "Are you going to take me away?" The directness of her question hung in the air. "I just want to talk right now," Ms. Reynolds replied gently. "Would you show me your painting?" What followed was an hour of careful conversation, with Ms. Reynolds observing the interactions between Adrian and Ella while asking the child seemingly casual questions about her daily routine, her feelings, her understanding of the situation. Adrian remained tense throughout, aware that every response was being evaluated. Finally, Ms. Reynolds asked for a private moment with Adrian. "Ella, would you mind giving us a few minutes to talk?" she requested. Ella looked at Adrian, who nodded reassuringly. "It's all right. Why don't you go show your painting to Helena?" he suggested, referring to the nanny. When they were alone, Ms. Reynolds' professional demeanor remained firmly in place. "Mr. Wolf, I'll be candid. This is an unusual situation." "I'm aware," Adrian replied dryly. "Ella seems comfortable here. That's positive. She speaks about you with genuine affection, which I admit I wasn't expecting given how recently you came into her life." Adrian felt an unexpected warmth at this assessment. "However," Ms. Reynolds continued, "there are legitimate concerns about your suitability as a primary caregiver. Your work demands, your lack of experience, your—" She hesitated. "Emotional availability." "What are you suggesting?" Adrian asked, tension coiling in his chest. Ms. Reynolds placed a folder on the table between them. "You have two options, Mr. Wolf. Sign the legal guardianship papers, committing fully to being Ella's father in every sense of the word, or allow her to be placed in foster care until a more suitable permanent arrangement can be found." "Foster care?" Adrian repeated, the words feeling like a physical blow. "Yes, it's not ideal, but sometimes it's necessary while we determine the best long-term solution." "I'm her father," Adrian said, the words coming without hesitation now. "Biologically, yes. But are you prepared to be her father in all the ways that matter? Not just financially, but emotionally? Can you put her needs above your own, above your business, above the empire you've built?" The question struck at the heart of Adrian's identity. For decades, Wolf Enterprises had been his primary focus, his purpose, his mission, his legacy. Could he truly shift those priorities? And yet, the thought of Ella in foster care, being passed from home to home, waiting for someone to decide her fate, it was unbearable in a way Adrian couldn't have imagined 3 weeks ago. "I want her to stay with me," he said firmly. Ms. Reynolds studied him carefully. "This isn't a business negotiation, Mr. Wolf. I need to be convinced that you understand what you're committing to. Parenthood isn't a temporary project or a quarterly goal. It's forever." Adrian thought of the past weeks, the bedtime stories, the awkward attempts at comfort, the small moments of connection that had somehow begun to matter more than board meetings and acquisitions. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'm prepared to make that commitment." Ms. Reynolds didn't look entirely convinced. "There will be follow-up visits, regular check-ins, resources you'll need to engage with, parenting classes, possibly family therapy." "Whatever is required," Adrian agreed without hesitation. She pushed the guardianship papers toward him. "Then sign here. This makes you Ella's legal guardian. It's not the same as formal adoption, which we can discuss later, but it establishes your legal right and responsibility to care for her. Adrian picked up the pen but paused before signing. "May I speak with Ella first?" Ms. Reynolds nodded, a hint of approval in her expression. "Of course. I'll wait here." Adrian found Ella in the kitchen with the nanny, carefully washing paint from her hands. "Ella, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" When they were alone in the living room, Adrian knelt to meet her at eye level, something he'd learned to do over the past weeks. "Ms. Reynolds has brought some papers for me to sign," he explained. "Papers that would make me legally responsible for you. That would mean you would stay here, with me, permanently." Ella's expression remained carefully neutral. "Like adoption?" "Similar, yes. It would mean I would be your legal guardian." "And if you don't sign?" Adrian hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Then you might need to stay somewhere else for a while." Fear flickered across her face. "In foster care? Possibly." Ella was quiet for a long moment, seemingly processing this information. "Do you want to sign them?" she finally asked. The question caught Adrian off guard. 3 weeks ago, the answer would have been an unequivocal no. 3 weeks ago, his priorities had been clear, uncomplicated by emotional considerations. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." "Why?" The directness of a child, cutting through pretense. Adrian considered the question carefully. "Because I've come to care about what happens to you. Because you deserve stability and security. Because ... because you're my dad," Ella suggested quietly. The word hung between them, loaded with meaning. He hadn't used it himself, had kept their relationship defined in clinical biological terms. But hearing it from her, so simple, so fundamental, crystallized something within him. "Yes," Adrian said softly. "Because I'm your dad." Ella's smile began slowly, then bloomed across her face, genuine, unguarded happiness that transformed her features. Without warning, she threw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. Adrian froze momentarily, then carefully returned the embrace. It felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome, this physical expression of connection that had been absent from his life for so long. "Can I come with you when you sign?" she asked when she finally pulled away. "If you'd like to." Hand in hand, they returned to where Ms. Reynolds waited with the papers. Adrian signed without hesitation, his signature bold and decisive, the same way he signed billion-dollar contracts, though this document would prove far more consequential to his life. "So, I stay?" Ella asked as Ms. Reynolds gathered the signed papers. "You stay," Adrian confirmed. That night, after Ms. Reynolds had gone with promises of follow-up visits, after dinner and homework and the now familiar bedtime routine, Adrian sat on the edge of Ella's bed for their nightly story. "Can I ask you something?" Ella dijo mientras terminaba de leer. "Of course. Is it okay if I call you Dad?" Not Adrian anymore? Something tightened in Adrian's chest, not the constriction of anxiety or stress that he was accustomed to, but a fullness that felt both painful and necessary. "Yes," he managed, his voice unusually thick. "That would be okay." "Good night, Dad," she said softly, testing the word. Adrian tucked the blankets around her and switched off the lamp. "Good night, Ella." Walking back to his office, Adrian passed his assistant, who was working late, organizing his schedule for the coming week. "Cancel my morning meetings tomorrow," he instructed, "and find information about good schools in the area. Ella will need to enroll soon." His assistant nodded, seemingly unsurprised by this further evidence of his changing priorities. "And the Carson Technologies contract revision? The board is expecting it tomorrow." Adrian considered this, weighing the competing demands on his time in a way that would have been unthinkable a month ago. It can wait, he decided. Some things are more important. Later that night, as Adrian sat in his office, he found himself looking not at financial reports but at school brochures. His phone buzzed with messages from board members and executives, but for once, he felt no urgency to respond. Instead, his gaze was drawn to the small photograph now framed on his desk. Ella on her first day of art class, smiling proudly beside a colorful painting, the first personal item to ever occupy space among his business awards and credentials. The ruthless Adrian Wolfe, once known only for cold-blooded business tactics and relentless ambition, had discovered something no acquisition or merger had ever provided. A reason beyond himself, a purpose beyond the next deal. A little girl had called him Dad, and somehow, in that simple word, his perfectly structured life had found its missing piece.